So organizations such as Ernest Thompson Seton's Woodcraft Indians and Charlotte and Luther Gulick's Campfire Girls both imagined new kinds of Indians. And like their revolutionary forefathers, they acted out their ideas in costume play. At the turn of the 20th century, everything turned inside out. The Indian that Americans hated had once been the savage, so distant from the self, right? They built national identities on the noble Indian, so close to the continent and to the essence of America. Now, the savage Indian was the one who had assimilated white American culture for the worst. And in doing so, he had lost all nobility and succumbed to the worst features of modernity. He was so American and so modern that he was likely to be represented through a new image, that of the degraded drunk, right? The drunken Indian lying in the gutter. The noble Indian, the one to be emulated, was the Indian who had not succumbed to society and civilization, who remained wild and untamed, authentic and real. That was the Indian who generations of modern Americans would make their own through institutions like Campfire, Boy Scouts, YMCA Indian Guides, sports mascots, and New Age sweat lodge ceremonies. The great irony to be found in the admonition to be an Indian is that its author was in fact a native person, the Seneca Museum anthropologist and political activist Arthur C. Parker. And this points to a final set of arguments that I'd like to make today, some of which can be found in this other book, which is, like the first book, an excellent holiday gift. Something to tweet about, perhaps. Hashtag MC Democracy just found ideal gift for Aunt Rosie. Yeah, exactly. Go ahead, type that in. Type that in. So to get there, right, to get to this final set of arguments, it will be useful to backtrack to the 19th century one more time, to the dime novel tradition, and most particularly to the dime novel starring William F. Buffalo Bill Cody. These widespread, inexpensive little books proliferated in the latter half of the 19th and the early 20th century, spreading the images of Indian savagery, nobility, and disappearance across the country. What matters more, though, is what Cody did with them. Drawing on the traditions of the theatrical stage and exhibitions such as Catlin, Cody formed what was called the Buffalo Bill Combination, in which actual Western scouts, like real live Western scouts, he's shown here with Wild Bill Hickok and Texas Jack Omohundro, got on stage and reenacted supposed actual Western scenes. It turns out that Buffalo Bill was very good at this acting and that Wild Bill Hickok was not very good at this acting. And he did not have a particularly long career, but Cody did. So he's got this kind of thing going on about dramatic performance, combining this dramatization with Western rodeo games and with the traveling infrastructure created by railroads and trailblazed by circuses. In other words, here's a guy who's knitting together all the kind of classic 19th century forms of popular culture and institutional and industrial things. Cody and his backers created the Wild West Show, one of the most dominant forces in American cultural history in any time or place. You can see the scale of the thing in this image, right? Huge sets, an enormous set of bleachers that could accommodate as many as 11,000 people per show. So we don't tend to think about audiences in the late 19th and early 20th century being this large, but in fact, this is what Cody could assemble and disassemble and take on the road, right? Seating for 11,000. Cody insisted that his show was an educational experience, and he made the argument by pointing to the authenticity of his cast and props. So the Deadwood stage that got attacked by Indians, like that was a real stage that had really driven on the Deadwood route. And so whatever action was performed around it must be true, right? The cowboys were real, and so were the horses, and so were the bison. And the most real thing out there, the thing that made the Wild West so appealing to so many, were the real Indians. Now, Cody's show ran for almost 30 years. And though he hired a range of Indian people, he came quickly to rely upon a single annual job fair at the Pine Ridge Lakota Reservation. So each spring, Cody would visit Rushville, Nebraska, and he would hire between 75 and 100 Lakota people to work in his show. These people traveled across the country and on Cody's tours of Europe. Some of them, Red Shirt, this very handsome guy, became established with the show and returned for many, many seasons. These were not reservation recluses, right? These were not people sort of moping around following military defeat. These were traveling, cosmopolitan, modern actors. And for folks in the class, we were talking, today in both classes about sort of how you see things and how you try to pull things out of the stream, right, and kind of hang on to them and make them into something. And I had read many times, right, that Cody came to Nebraska, but sort of thinking about doing it over 30 years, there was one moment where I thought, wait a minute, 30 years? That's an entire generation, right? More than a generation, right? Wow, this was actually constituting an industry of performance and acting on this particular reservation over this period of time. And suddenly, it all became very apparent. No, I should have seen that all along, but in fact, I didn't, right? So this is kind of how it happens. Now, the Wild West, to continue this kind of genealogical sort of tracing, the Wild West points us in two critical directions. First, you can draw a direct line between the Wild West and much early filmmaking. When Wild West shows finished their seasons, they were left with this expensive plant sitting idle for several months. All those real bison, all those real horses, all those real wagons, what do you do with them? Now, in the early 20th century, filmmaking was first developing as a commercial art, and among the many storylines being converted from print narratives into film were those found in all those old dime novels and in the Wild West show itself. So it took no great leap of imagination to understand that the capital investments of those shows, horses, wagons, bison, stages, cabins, actors, could be put to good use during the off-season as film props. The Wild West, in other words, helped give direction to a great deal of early filmmaking. And it is not by accident that the Western became one of the dominant genre forms up through the 1960s. It was part because of the institutional materiality of the Wild West show. The second thread is that it turns out that many Indian actors also followed a straight line from the Wild West out to California and to new work in the film industry. This picture up here on the far left shows, this is Santa Monica. This is what is today Santa Monica. Right? These are the hills outside Santa Monica. When Arthur C. Parker observed that girls love to dress up as Red Wings and Minnehaha's, he was actually referring to a real person, Princess Red Wing, the first American Indian film star. With her somewhat sketchy husband, James Youngdeer, Red Wing starred in a number of early silent films, and indeed the two of them wrote, directed, and produced as well, creating films that challenged many of the stereotypical images that we've been seeing. And if you're interested in this, there's actually a nice clip of this film, White Fawn's Devotion, that you can actually see, online. It's about 7 or 8 minutes long, something like that. And it's pretty interesting. I recommend it. All these Indian people had, in some ways, to perform Indian for white audiences in order to be taken seriously as Indian people. And that meant, in many cases, reinforcing some of the stereotypes, the images, the expectations that we've seen, even as they tried to call others into question. After a couple of centuries during which Indian people had been implanted into the American cultural imaginations in certain ways, and I hope I've come some way towards convincing you of this, non-Indians had developed a set of expectations about them that continue to structure the ways that Indians appear in both cultural texts and in human consciousness. And they're embedded in you, they're embedded in me in these certain kinds of ways, through the ways that our culture reproduces itself through us. So I focused on the visual and the literary, but let me offer you just one last little quick example of this, the musical, because we have to talk about music, right? So take, as another example, the sound of Indianness. Now, this is a kind of an interesting and amazing thing, because you can create the sound of Indianness very, very quickly. All you need is a descending minor third interval and a short, long rhythm and a beat that goes dum, 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 right? So, da, da, dum, dum. There they are, Look, they're coming over the hill. They're riding across the hill. Da, da, dum, dum. And for those of you musicians in the audience, think about this, right? There was a moment in the early 20th century where there was this thing called the Indigenous school of composers, right? And if you imagine playing like a blues scale in your left hand and putting this sort of open fifth pounding rhythm, blues scale, right? Sounds really Indian, right? Piano players, you're nodding with me, right? Yeah. Now put a dominant 7 chord in there. Like, oh yeah, no, this is the blues. All of a sudden, right, we've shifted right from a red form to a black form. Interesting, right? And composers played around with these things in interesting ways in the early 20th century, and we don't have time to talk about this, but it's fascinating for people who are interested in thinking about music. So you combine these things and you have this mental picture of Indians developed over sweeps of time through multiple cultural productions. So the Indian singers of the early 20th century, people like Princess Chinina, Askenanton, the great Iroquois baritone, Irene Eastman, the Indian soprano, others, they had to sing those notes, da-da-da-da, right, in order to be recognized. After they won that recognition as Indians, they went on, though, to do other things, to sing opera, to sing popular music, trying to complicate the mental pictures of Indians that floated in the minds of their audiences, right? They challenged those images. So Indians active in doing these kinds of things. And you could say something similar about many, many other Indian people in the early 20th century, the proliferation of Indian athletes in the early 20th century. And I'll just, the sort of character in the middle down below there is my grandfather, right? My grandfather, raised at Standing Rock Reservation, went to a Episcopal Church boarding school in Nebraska, then recruited in 1922 to play football at what is now Bard College, and was then St. Stephen's, where he was an honorable mention All-American in 1922, right? This is an interesting story, and it turns out my grandfather was not alone, right? Jim Thorpe, this is Charles Albert Chief Bender of Philadelphia Athletics, great pitcher. 1913 World Series had 3 Indian players in it. You know, this is pretty amazing. So you can say something similar, right, about the ways these folks had to represent as Indians in order to actually think about changing things up. Or about folks like these people, Will Rogers, Rosebud Yellow Robe, a radio star, Maria Tallchief, one of the great prima ballerina dancers of the 20th century, and the other 4 great Indian ballerinas. The art and design leader, Lloyd Kiva New, or about activists at Alcatraz, or in other moments in the politics of culture that characterized so much of the 1960s and 70s, or about so many other Indian people across this same sweep of time. Now, just to kind of pause lightly on my own family, I've just kind of added this slide in. It doesn't, it just deals, this is a very paternal kind of, kind of thing. But you can see my father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather, all there together, all doing similar kinds of things, right? All representing but contesting these kinds of images. So there have always been Indian people, creative people, political people, just everyday people who have contested these images, and that's an important thing to know. They've used them to create their own sense of identity, or even their own arts, literatures, musics, images, and indeed, American Indian cultures themselves in the biggest and most enduring sense of the word. Those Indian people, though, have constantly had to negotiate the vast historical weight of Indian images, expectations, and stereotypes. These things are not just good, harmless fun, right? They're not just innocent things. They are productive. They're productive of American identity. Like, they produce American identity. They're productive of the nation itself. So it should come as no surprise then that when we peer deeply into American culture, we actually do find Indians everywhere. Thank you so much.
Dr. Deloria has offered to answer a few questions. We have 2 mic runners out there, Douglas and Eli. So if you would like to ask a question, let me ask that you simply raise your hand, and one of our mic runners will run to you. Questions for Dr. Deloria?
It is a pretty comprehensive thing, I think.
Hi. So I was wondering if there was a particular reason that you refer to American Indians as such rather than Native Americans.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that's always worth kind of pausing and landing on. There's a lot of different kinds of ways in which Indian people identify themselves, in which they're talked about. Most Native people prefer, if we're talking in a specific tribal context, to use a tribal name. So, for example, when we're in tribal contexts, I would say Lakota, right? That's because that's a tribal context. When you move to the more general category, then it becomes a little less clear, and there's a huge range of things that you can draw upon. American Indian, Native American, Aboriginal, in Canada, First Nation, Indigenous, all these things actually have slightly different kinds of meanings and different sorts of uses. There's been a sort of moment in American education where I think people have said to many, many students, many teachers have said to many students, don't say American Indian, say Native American. And I think it dates to kind of some of the kind of, some of the ethnic politics around naming that come out of the late 60s, 70s, and the early 80s. But the fact is that when most American Indian people that I know and interact with, when they talk about Indian people in general, they use Indian rather than Native American more often, which is not to say that people don't use both of those. They alternate back and forth. But when you talk to people, for example, there's a kind of reservation talk, right? So it's not just Indian, it's like Indian, right? So that becomes a kind of collective point of recognition and identity. You can date some of these things by, in interesting ways, I think, by sort of tracing the foundations of various American Indian movements. So 1911, the Society of American Indians, first great American Indian sort of political lobbying group and think tank. 1940s, the National Congress of American Indians. When you get to the late 60s, though, you get something like the Native American Rights Fund, right? And that comes out of a kind of specific historical moment when hyphenated American, Irish American, Italian American, Native American actually sort of made a certain amount of sense. Now, what's interesting is at that time, right, for what we would now say African American, the usage was still, in general, sort of Negro, right, or Afro. And we can actually date the change in that usage. I can remember it in the 1980s. Jesse Jackson said, well, it's time for us to start saying African American, and let's do that. So there's a moment where you can see the changes in these different kinds of usages. Just to say one last thing, we use indigenous a lot these days, but for a lot of tribal people, that has a different kind of resonance. Tribal people would say, no, I'm really focused on my tribe, my nation, my tribal nation, my land. Indigenous, I don't know what that is, right? That's kind of mushy and blurry. And in fact, Indigenous has a much more kind of global and transnational sort of set of meanings attached to it. It's good and productive conversations happen under the name Indigenous. And in other countries around Aboriginal as the kind of local version of that. All of which is to say it's a really kind of complicated terrain about naming. And that some of the things I found that work best are to alternate and to move around in different things so that you can never actually be pinned down and sort of focus in, and to get as specific as you can whenever the case allows.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, thank you for speaking today. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned about the museum in DC and how you were working to change some of the exhibits, I believe, in one of the museums. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Right. So the Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., it was a major, major achievement. Indian people worked on this for a really long time. Suzanne Schoen Harjo, who was one of the people in one of these images, worked on this thing for decades, along with many, many other people. When the museum was planned, Museum's Enabling Act happened in 1989. It took a while to actually get the Mall Museum built. And when it was built, the Mall Museum was really inflected by a kind of 1990s museum practice, which was in turn sort of influenced by postmodern and post-structural kind of thinking about objects in space and things like that. So how many people have been to this museum? So when you think about this, you look at some of those galleries, and they make more sense looked at from above than they do as you're moving through them. Right? There's not a linear kind of narrative which we've come to expect in museums. It's very fragmented. Right? You walk in here, and then you see something different, and then you walk in here. It was also really important. So part of the problem with some of these exhibits has to do with a kind of museum philosophy that has now become a little bit out of date and actually didn't really work very well. Second thing that museum was really committed to was bringing native voices in a tribal kind of way into that space. And so many of those exhibits are characterized by little pods in which tribes, in consultation with the museum, develop their own exhibits, right? This was their own voice in the National Museum of the American Indian. This is a really, really good thing. It turns out this is really hard and really expensive and actually breaks up the museum even more. And so you're wandering through a fragmented kind of narrative, and you're now routed out into other little pods of spaces which give you tribal stories. So critics hated this museum. They really hated it. At the same time, Indian people really loved it. Indian people loved it because this is this is our museum, it's our voice, and we did it. And it's on the mall, and it's as close to the capital as you get. This is a really, really good thing. When they opened the museum, Native people came from all over the country. So it's a really good thing, really something to be very proud of. But museum critics really hated it. They hated it because of the fragmentation. They hated it because there was no clear narrative line. They hated it because of what they saw as an outdated practice. They hated it because there's so many great objects and artifacts in the museum that aren't actually on display. They're not actually, being used. So 10 years after those exhibits then, which is where we're at right now, what we've decided to do is to respond to those critics. And I think it's partly because we've now had 10 years of sort of saying, this is an Indian voice, this is what it looks like. We're here, we're on the mall. And now I think people feel much more comfortable saying, okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to retell American history and embed Indians, not just embed Indians, make Indian people absolutely central to a telling of American history. And that started with the opening of an exhibit in September on treaties and the ways that treaties actually structure so much of American life. And so I think it's a very positive kind of start. Critics kind of liked it. Pretty much liked it, I think. But it's got a straight narrative. It kind of walks you through. It's a complicated exhibit. It's pretty text heavy, so it's not super friendly museologically. But it's very, very strong in its message, and it's important. And then we'll be redoing the other exhibits. So we'll have one that is kind of basically old stuff, one that is basically American history, and one that is basically contemporary world. They'll be rolling those out. I'm off the board in December. I have to stop saying we about this, I guess. But we'll be rolling those out over the next 5 years or so. It'll be worth going back to Washington to see.
Sorry. So you keep using this term, American popular imagination. So I'm just wondering why you never use cultural appropriation in your speech, because it seems like a lot of these things are cultural appropriation, like wearing a headdress or like historians and things. So I just wanted to speak on that.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. Cultural appropriation is a good term and it's a critical term, but my own sense is it's actually a little bit limited relative to what I want to do, and and that's partly because I think I've tried to sort of think about culture in kind of the largest sort of sense. Like, what is it? Like, what is culture, right? We always it's the life ways of a people, right? We say those kinds of things. I think the things that are important about culture, to me, that are most important about culture are the ways that it, on the one hand, is constantly reproducing itself, right? And so it is dragging its legacy behind. The 19th century does matter to the present moment. So culture is constantly dragging its legacy behind it, and it's constantly transforming. So this is a weird, contradictory, paradoxical kind of thing, right? It's old and it's new. It's always new, right? Culture is always reinventing, always producing new kinds of things. And because of that, it actually is, I think, somewhat hard to pin down around, well, let me say this differently. You can pin it down around certain kinds of contesting factions, and I think that's what an argument about cultural appropriation does. But if you think about the larger kind of landscape of culture, it becomes a little harder, I think, to pin down and say, you did this to him, you did this to her, you did this to, those things. I'd rather think about culture in these larger possible terms, in the ways that it gets into the heart and the soul, right, of individual people, right? So we can go down to the micro level, down to you and you and you and you, and say culture is embedded in the heart and soul, and it's got all of that old stuff dragging behind it and all this new stuff. And because it is in you and you and you and you, it also is the social property of groups of people, right? And putting the boundary lines on who those social groups of people are is not that easy a thing, right? It's very easy to sort of say, this visibly identifiable social and political group, right? I identify this group how? By their political boundaries, by the social boundaries that get drawn upon them, and then to say that group has a culture, right? And this other group here has a different culture. And so the lines, which can be drawn more firmly in the political and the social arena, right, actually are mapped onto culture. And I just don't think culture's lines are quite so clear and coherent, right? I think they blur together a lot more. And so, so one could say, yeah, this is a long history of American cultural appropriations of Indianness, but I think that's, for me, that ends up being, that's a politically powerful and politically salient kind of critique, but I think it actually shortchanges the analytical possibilities of a kind of broader picture of culture. And it took me a little bit of rambling to get around to that point, and I apologize for that. But, so it's not that these aren't cultural appropriations, but I think some of them, I think when you look at a hipster wearing a headdress and you say that's a cultural appropriation, that's cool and that makes sense. But for me, it makes more sense to sort of put that in the context of this big, long, huge, enormous history in which the boundaries are a little blurrier, right? Because the time is so large and the space is so large and the groups of people are so large, it becomes harder to sort of pin down and say, you know, that, you know, sort of thing. It's also probably my instinct to, you know, to try to avoid some politics and to, you know, if I can trade politics for things that are analytically interesting, I kind of always do that. And frankly, that's a reaction against my father, who would always put politics ahead of the analytically interesting. Everybody gets a little Oedipal thing here and there.
Well, with that, let me ask that you join me in thanking Dr. Deloria.